I learned from the students that yesterday I posted the wrong link to the recording, and I'm very sorry about that. I have essentially no idea what I'm doing. So it has been fixed. So after all of the lectures, as soon as it's finished uploading, I'll post the link to the Zoom lecture in case you want to go back and watch it on your own time. Because that is the plan for the semester, so that it can be asynchronous. So I'm sorry about that first one. And also, apparently, the Moodle had listed the date of your weekly discussions as Thursday at midnight instead of Friday. So I went back and corrected that this morning as well. So
when's the first paper due?
Your first paper is due Thursday at midnight.
Thank you.
So I think that's almost everybody. Okay. So what we're going to do today is try the screen sharing option again with two exceptions. So there's two short YouTube clips that I want to show you, but what I've discovered is that if I try to show YouTube clips over Zoom, the lag is just kind of insane. So what we'll do is we'll just pause, and the links are on Moodle, so we'll just pause and you can go watch it in a separate browser, and then we'll come back and talk about them. Because otherwise it just gets kind of ugly and fuzzy, and the talking and the voices are separate. So what we will do first is I will share my screen. So what I'm going to do is just go through the slideshow the way that I have it written and tell you all about it, but I will regularly be pausing for questions. So can you see my face in the corner? Guys?
I can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen at all. Okay, hold on. Let me go back and do this again. Share screen, just this one. Okay, now you're seeing the slideshow?
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay. Sorry about that, y'all. All right, you ready? Okay, here we go. I'm excited. Okay. So the first thing to talk about is the fact that I didn't name this course, and people who are teaching now didn't name this course, and it's just been named this for like 20 years. So I wanted to talk about the title of the course and kind of what it even means and why we have this. So we're going to start with a little bit of a wall of text, which I usually don't do, but I wanted to give you an idea of the various definitions we have, even for this very simple phrase, for historical perspectives. So in reality, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. And one way of looking at it is this top definition, this idea that historical perspective is about understanding the larger picture around what's going on. The social, the cultural, the intellectual, the emotional, all of the things that were happening during the historical event that we're talking about. So one idea of historical perspectives is that sort of like macro view, that global view. The other idea of historical perspectives is that each individual human has their own perspective. So essentially there's the macro view and the micro view. So if you are talking about a historical event and you have a very definitive point of view based on your cultural background or your sort of decision about what you think really happened, that's a historical perspective. But if we're thinking about a historical event big picture, that's another much larger historical perspective. So it's a tricky phrase because already there's two definitions. That's very important though, because most of what we're going to talk about this semester is this idea that the perspective is the issue. Are you looking at it from a very singular point, or are you looking at it as part of a larger whole? So what historical perspectives means for this class is going to be examining things as part of a larger, bigger social picture, which is hard to do. Very hard thing to do, as you've probably noticed if you've been watching the news the last few days. Similarly, what the social order means has two definitions. So one definition of the social order is simply like a lack of chaos. Do we have order because we have laws, because we have police, because we have jail? The other idea is a little bit more sociological. It's this idea that the social order is comprised of all of the things that we believe to be important. So again, we have these two sort of contrasting definitions. One is social structures, is institutions, it's religion, it's race, it's gender, it's all of the things that we socially use to make our decisions. So the other one, of course, social order is laws, police, is the army. So again, for this course, we are mostly talking about the big picture definition. We're talking about social order in terms of how society organizes itself outside of law, outside of punishment. So as an example, In core 200 and 201 and 202, you read these. You may remember Thomas Hobbes. He's the one that wrote Leviathan. This is the cover of Leviathan, which I've always loved so much. In the Bible, Leviathan is a sea monster. It's like a gigantic sea monster that eats people. So it's a weird choice for a name of a book, but whatever. And you may recall Thomas Hobbes was the one who talked about when you join society, you essentially sign a social contract. And the social contract says that you agree essentially to participate in the laws in exchange for being protected. So essentially you agree not to murder anybody in exchange for not being murdered. And it's a big ask, this idea that we should give up our right, for instance, to just shoot people who walk by our house. But again, what we're getting in exchange for that is the right to walk around without being shot by strangers. Again, most of the time. Discussion on Thursday is going to be so good. But for Thomas Hobbes, he had a very bleak version of the social order, and he had a very bleak version of humanity. The famous thing that he said that I talk about all the time is that life is nasty and brutish and short. And so he thought we had to join into the social order in order to be protected. So Durkheim had a similar sort of view of the social order. These are kind of the major people we get the idea of social order from. And you probably remember Durkheim from just last semester. And he's the one that said that we organize our society based on how similar we are, based on our shared cultural values. You might remember the mechanical and organic solidarity. Those of you who were in my 202 class, I'm sure you have it memorized. But he was basically talking about social cohesion, that the social order is made up of the people that we like and the people that we hang out with. Marx, I'm sure you remember, the Communist Manifesto. He had a real dark version too, but his theory was that social order was based entirely on the economy and what kind of job you had. Either you were a member of the bourgeoisie who owned the means of production, or you were a proletariat and your sole contribution to society was working. So these three guys, and as always, old white men, but these three guys basically form our idea of what the social order is. It's not compulsory. It's something that we agree to. It's something that's based on the people that we like, and it's something that is in large part based on our place in society. So the social order that we're going to talk about, again, big picture, sociological. Okay, so now it starts to get weird. So this is the hardest thing about historical perspectives, which is this idea that when we think about history, when we think about history classes, we think about learning the truth. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today is what you learned in your history classes and why. But this idea of truth can get very philosophical. And if you've taken a philosophy class, you've probably sat around and talked about this idea that maybe there are multiple truths, and maybe each person has their own truth. If you got high with your classmates in your dorm, which you're not supposed to do, but whatever, it's a college tradition. You had this conversation. What's even truth, man? You're kind of supposed to do that in college. That's kind of what you do. So this idea of not having one ultimate truth is tricky, and it's annoying. So if you can think about if you've ever heard someone tell a story about something that you were there for, and they told a weird version of it, and you're like, well, that's not what happened. That might be their truth. That might be the way that they remember it. This is one of the reasons that eyewitness accounts are incredibly unreliable. Human brains filter things, and we change things, and we redecorate things to kind of suit what we want to be happening. So the nature of truth is kind of impossible. There are some things that we can absolutely point to. There are some, scientific things that we can point to. Usually in a historical sense, we can say what day something happened. Usually we can say who was there. We can say how many people died for sure sometimes. But why we did things is much more tricky. And that's the majority of what we're going to talk about over the course of the semester is yeah, sure, these wars happened, and we know where and when and who was there, but why? Always the big question. So this cartoon that I've listed here is a pretty famous sort of comedic quip from Groucho Marx, who was, of course, way before your time, but, ask your grandparents. And he was really famous for this joke about who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? And Richard Pryor did it again in the 70s. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? Typically it is said by men who have been cheating on women and they don't want the women to know that, but it's sort of a famous phrase, this idea that you have a choice what to believe. You can believe the truth, or you can believe your lying eyes, or you can believe whatever makes you the happiest. And so again, in discussion this week, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys think about this idea that you can choose to believe something that might not be objectively true. So the nature of truth, real tricky. So the other problem with historical perspectives is this phrase right here. And I imagine you've heard this before. History is written by the winners. Right? So this is like a pretty popular thing that we say. And one thing that's really important to note about this is only the losers say that, right? So if you are the winners and you wrote down history, you're like, yeah, that's what happened. Like, I was there, that's what happened. But if you're the losers and you read this account, you might be like, yeah, that's not at all what happened. So we see this a lot. And this idea is that whoever wins survives, for one thing, and has the power and the means and the motive to write down history the way that they want history to be written down. So this happens all of the time, that we have one version of a historical event and then we find out more later, or we find original sources later and find out that it wasn't what we thought. But this idea that history is written by the winners is so common that there's like a version of it in every language. There's a version of it in most cultures. Like, we're familiar with this idiom that only the people who win write it down. So a current example, just last month, God, things are moving so quickly. I can't even keep track of what happens when. William Barr, who's our Attorney General, who you guys probably recognize his face, yeah? William Barr. Okay. So he was doing an interview, and basically they were talking about Michael Flynn, who used to be the security director for the Trump administration, and he's the one who pled guilty to lying to the FBI. He pled guilty twice. But in May, they decided to drop charges against him and let him out of jail. And so William Barr was doing an interview, and the reporter asked him, when history looks back, like, what do you think they'll say? And William Barr said, well, history is written by the winners, so it largely depends on who's writing the history. So often we think of these things as unrelated to us, or like sort of removed from us. Like, this is something that happens to other people. This is something that happens a long time ago. But I just want to be clear that this idea that history is written by the winners is literally happening right now. It's literally being said by people who are very powerful within our current presidential administration. So this idea that the people who have the most power are the people who make the lasting impression is still a very, very current thing. So I'm not going to show you a clip of William Barr, but just trust he was making that face. Okay, so the major thing we're going to address today is this concept of historical narratives. So that's exactly what it sounds like. What are the stories that we tell about history, and how do those stories gain power and importance? So my favorite example is George Washington. George Washington is so interesting, and we're going to learn so much about him this semester. So let's start with this picture on the left. So what do y'all know about George Washington and his cherry tree?
He chopped it down.
Yes. And then what?
And then he ate the cherries.
He might have.
And then it grew back.
I don't think that part's true. Anybody else? What did you learn about the cherry tree? No? Oh, this is a famous story. So the story goes, when George Washington was little, he got a hatchet and he chopped down a cherry tree, and then his dad was mad at him, and he was like, what happened? And George Washington said, I cannot tell a lie. Sounding familiar? Yeah. And then his dad was like, well, I'm not mad at you because you didn't lie. And as it turns out, that is in every way untrue. George Washington, I mean, maybe he had a hatchet, but that story didn't happen. One of the things that's really interesting, again, about historical narratives is who invents the stories from scratch. So there was this guy, this biographer, whose name was Weems, which for some reason I find funny. And after George Washington died, he started writing a biography of George Washington, and he put that story in there, even though it never happened. But the story was so believable. Like, it sounded right. It sounded like something George Washington would do. So everybody was like, yeah, and they just kind of glommed onto it. So this other guy wrote a primer for elementary school students, and he put that story in there, and everybody was like, yeah, it must be true. And then P.T. Barnum, who you probably know about, had the traveling sideshow. So he had a woman who they said was the slave who raised George Washington, which couldn't possibly have happened. She would be like 50 years too young, but she repeated the story too as part of the sideshow. So this story that we sort of know when we tell children about George Washington saying, "I cannot tell a lie." Like, that's, I think, a really good example of historical narrative. It feels true. It seems like it could have happened, but it never did. So my other example with George Washington, here in the middle, we see wooden teeth. So when you were little, did you learn that George Washington had wooden teeth? Okay, this is a pretty common one. I don't know why we say this. You can make teeth out of wood, but like, we think people said that he had wooden teeth in order to make him more relatable, because wooden teeth was very much like a poor person thing. But in reality, he had these teeth right here. That's actually George Washington's dentures. They're on display. You can go look at them. So his teeth were made of lead, and they were made of ivory, but also they were made of other people's teeth, which is super creepy. But at the time, you could sell your teeth to the dentist, and then the dentist would make dentures out of them. So these teeth were hopefully taken from people who wanted to sell their teeth. It's possible they were taken from cadavers, and it's possible they were outright taken from slaves. So essentially, even though we tell each other and children that George Washington was rolling around with wooden teeth, really he was wearing someone else's teeth, and apparently he was very bad at keeping them clean. It was a problem for his dentist. So sorry for grossing you out with some teeth, but they're just so weird, just so weird. So again, historical narratives, we're making this shit up as we go. Okay. Now, here is where it gets especially timely. The problem with thinking about an objective version of truth has, in the last couple of years, gotten a lot more difficult. We are, what people are saying a lot lately is that we're living in a post-truth world. There's this idea that we used to think things are true or things are false, and now we think everything is fake news. And a major part of that is the fact that cable news channels have gone 24 hours a day, and generally speaking, there is not 24 hours worth of news, so they had to fill that time. And what they chose to fill that time was mostly commentary, was like opinion pieces, and people, doing the talking heads, sitting in front of the camera and yelling about whatever they're yelling about. On both sides, to be fair, right? So what we're seeing is that people tune in to a news channel thinking that it will be the news, and instead it's opinions. So this idea of the news being opinions is very tricky, but also we've entered into a phase where we no longer believe that truth is truth. We're looking at fake news, and we're looking at alternative facts. So this is where we're going to take our first pause. So what I'd like for you to do is go to Moodle and look at the first slideshow, the first YouTube link that is called White House Spokesman Offers Alternative Facts to Inauguration Crowd. And I will go ahead and play it, although, again, this may sort of mess with your audio, so it's probably better for you to watch it in another browser, but I'll go ahead and play it too.
Sorry, where is it on Moodle?
It's under this link. Sorry, let me stop it just in case it's going. So if you go to Moodle, I don't know if y'all can see. I'm going to share my screen one more time so you can see what I'm looking at. Can you see my screen? See my
Yeah,
Moodle?
I can.
Okay, so on Moodle, each week is broken down. So this week, it's this one, the one that says alternative facts.
Okay.
And then the next one that we'll watch is this one, if you want to get that loaded in your browser. So here's Kellyanne again. Okay, did you guys see? Did that work? Mostly? No?
I didn't hear any of the audio.
Oh, that's okay. It's probably better if you watch it in your own because the lag is so bad.
Okay.
Okay, but Does the pausing to watch it in another browser work?
Yeah.
I'm looking at you guys, but I'm not hearing anything. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Because watching it on Zoom was going nowhere. Okay. So have you guys seen this before? When Kellyanne Conway was talking about alternative facts? Maybe not. Okay. Well, it became kind of a famous moment because basically what was going on was there was a difference in the inauguration crowd sizes. And the Trump administration was claiming that his size was bigger than Obama's. And then when they were pushed on this, they said, well, people who are saying that his crowd was smaller are giving you alternative facts. And that's not a thing. There's not alternative facts. That's not how facts work. But it became very, very powerful. And this idea that we could just release alternative facts into the world became very, very powerful. So again, during our current political situation, during everything that's going on with quarantine and with riots and with COVID, alternative facts are really having a moment, depending on what news channel you watch. I mean, if you were to scroll through and watch several, in succession, you would get a lot of different facts. So this concept of what we believe and who we believe is very important right now. This is an unusual time in history. So people are still getting together to talk about alternative facts and what that might even mean. So now let's talk about how these concepts impact the course. So essentially we've gone through what historical perspective might mean and what social order might mean, and also this idea that we might have multiple perspectives and multiple truths. So over the course of our little tiny summer semester, here are our goals. First, we are going to start with cataloging our current knowledge. That's what your first paper is about. You're going to kind of sit down and think to yourself like, all right, but what do I know right now? Then we're going to question where we got that knowledge, which is, the epitome of critical thinking. Then we're going to examine some new sources of knowledge. We're going to read, those 2 nonfiction books. We're going to read a fictional book, but from someone who was there. But also important, we're going to watch some really bad movies. And again, I chose these on purpose because this is very much about historical perspective. Why we make the movies that we make and why we tell the stories that we tell is very much a historical perspective issue. And then in the end, we'll come back and we'll compare and contrast what we have learned. So that's how it impacts our course. Let's move on. One of the things that we have to keep, I think, really carefully in mind is that in this course, we're talking solely about America and America's wars. I had to narrow it down somehow, right? So I decided the best thing to do was to narrow it down to America and to these 3 wars, because I feel like there just wasn't time for y'all to read anything else. So one of the most important things to remember is that America has a concept of itself that is very strong and it's very powerful, and it's not always correct. So the primary American narrative is that we started out great and we're getting better all the time. It's a little bit interrupted by this idea of make America great again, but apparently that worked according to the hats that I've seen lately. So one of the things that we have to be really careful about is this idea that we imagine ourselves to be on a constant upward trend. We imagine that America started great, revolution, democracy, and we have ever since just been on an upward trajectory. Like again, this picture over here on the right. But one of the problems is that that's not how history works. And I don't mean that to denigrate America, I just mean that's not how anything works, right? So we have to acknowledge that even though we do want to be on an upward trajectory, sometimes it gets real fuzzy in the middle. Sometimes we make massive mistakes, but we have the opportunity to course correct. So this is, I think, an important thing for us to remember, is that America was in fact not always great. But again, we have opportunities to course correct. The other thing is going to come out very clearly in our readings and has surprisingly been really timely again. And that's this idea of white supremacy. So Americans are super big on this. We love this idea that white people are the best and they deserve all the land and they deserve all of the businesses and they deserve all of the governmental positions and they deserve all of the wealth. And again, if you've been watching the news lately, you've probably noticed that this has become a problem. So it's important that we address this. This isn't a class on race, but it is a class on history. And so this is going to come up a lot. This idea that Americans are pretty convinced that when America is great, they mean white America is great. And again, it's a problem. So that's one of the things that I'm looking forward also to talking about in our discussions on Thursday. So as we talk about historical narratives, remember that America has a narrative about itself. I've been trying to reduce my dependence on memes, but then I decided not to because I love memes. But this is one of my favorites where America is saying, I have done nothing wrong ever in my life. And love
Would you
this.
like for us to use the discussion groups as kind of a support group?
They may end up that way this summer, yeah.
Okay.
I'm really glad that the discussion groups are going to be so small because it may end up that way because it should be the same 10 people hanging out every week all summer.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, American history, a real challenge. And that's one of the things that I think is actually very important for us to address. So let's talk about why we have learned the things that we've learned about American history. And the first issue is that most of us learn about American history in the classroom. So we start in kindergarten and go all the way through 12th grade, learning something very specific. So here we have an example of pre-K activities for children. And I wanted to talk about this. This is one of the things, again, that we'll talk about in your discussion groups is what you learned, for instance, in elementary school. And this can get a little bit tricky, right? Because there's an age at which you tell children about genocide, and maybe that's not kindergarten. You know what I mean? Like, I think the first Thanksgiving is a really good example of this. Here are some pictures of what we tend to teach children about the first Thanksgiving. And on the one hand, like, this is fine for a 5-year-old. There were Indians and there were pilgrims and they had dinner. Like, that's perhaps as much as you need to know if you are 5. Like, let's not shatter your world yet. But at the same time, we do have to pay attention to the extent to which we are prepared to lie to children and the extent to which we want them to know lies. So when you were little, you probably had a version of Thanksgiving like this. In your elementary school or your preschool, you probably dressed up and, you had this little like construction paper hats, and like little buckles on your shoes like pilgrims. And I mean, that was a great day at school. Like I actually really enjoy Thanksgiving food. So I get it. As you got older, you probably got a version somewhat more like this. And this is a little bit more realistic. This shows that that people were sharing food. They have oysters, which were historically accurate instead of a lot of historically inaccurate stuff like pumpkin pies. But again, as you can see, this is incredibly peaceful, and the white people are the ones offering the food. And one of the things that we know historically is that the white people were actually very bad at feeding themselves. In all fairness, Boston, the worst. It's very hard to grow crops there, and arriving in November or October, a huge mistake. But again, even though this is very slightly more realistic, what you see here is still not even a little bit what happened. So one of the things that I'm very interested in talking about with y'all, again on Thursday, is this idea that we teach a sort of sanitized version. So this one I'm also more interested in. As we age, we change what we teach children. So as the children become older, we change the kind of knowledge that we want them to have, and we do start to introduce harder concepts. We start to introduce things that America possibly did wrong. We start to introduce the fallout of some of our wars. But here's where it gets weird. The American school system right now is largely based on standardized tests. And this is likely familiar to you because you left it a few years ago. So you probably remember that most of your school year was based on preparing you for a test that you would take at the end. And what we call this is teaching to the test. And again, you've probably heard about this. But what ends up happening is that we force the students to like cram a bunch of information into their brains and then just regurgitate it onto like a sheet full of bubbles, a Scantron. And then when you leave the room, that's gone, right? And we know, like pedagogically, we know this is no way to learn. That's just a giant pile of bullshit. No one remembers the things that you cram. Nobody thinks history is interesting because we forced you to cram a bunch of numbers. Nobody cares about history if all you do is sit down and like learn a bunch of dates and then like prove that you learned them and then go home for the summer and forget everything. So we know that this is actually a very terrible way to learn. So one problem with the American educational system and one problem with the way that you learned about history and American history specifically is that you learned it so that you could essentially repeat it, like parrot it back. You didn't learn it so that you could know it. So part of the problem with this is, oh wait, sorry, textbooks. So textbooks, well, actually, let me talk about Columbus first. All right, here we have Christopher Columbus. So you guys chime in. What do we know about Christopher Columbus?
Didn't he?
Okay, wait, let me go back. I just realized that's not gonna work at all. All right, stop share. Okay, can we do the raise your hand function? I don't remember how to do that. Oh, there it is. All right, Ms. Moore, let's hear it. What do you know?
He was the original looter. He came and stole all the land from the Indians.
And gold. What else you know?
He shouldn't have a holiday because Americans love to talk about how, this and that in another country is bad or whatever. But Christopher Columbus, like she said, literally came over here and just destroyed people's lives. So it's not really something that should be celebrated. But yeah.
Yeah, a lot of states are turning Columbus Day into voting day. They're keeping the holiday but moving it to November, which I think is actually kind of cool. Mr. Jackson?
That he was actually rejected a bunch of times by, I think it was either a Spanish or a Portuguese court before going to America, and then he didn't even make it to America. He went to Central America and get all the looting. Never made it where he was supposed to go.
Yeah, that's a weird one. And then he still named them Indians, and everybody was like, yeah.
I have a fact.
Let's hear a fact.
Didn't he sail the ocean blue in 1492?
Yes, what a good song. Did y'all sing that song in elementary school?
Yeah.
The 1492 part is correct. Ms. Hamming?
That there was a lot of disease transfer after that, so a lot of people died.
That was really the biggest problem. When we think about the deaths that occurred among the indigenous people with Columbus, and also when the first white Americans came here, often we think about outright killing, but biological, well, it's hard to say it's biological warfare because it wasn't intentional, but the vast majority of the people who died from transmittable diseases. That's absolutely right. Let's see, Mr. Von Rossum?
Didn't he die still thinking that he landed in India?
Oh, I don't know.
That it was a continent that wasn't Asia.
Oh, that's hilarious. I mean, I believe it. Seems like navigation, oddly enough, not his strong suit, but I don't know. That would be kind of interesting that he died believing himself to have been successful. He did find a lot of gold. That part was true. That was nice. Okay, so it sounds like, at least to an extent, we learned a lot of the same things about Columbus. Ocean blue, 1492, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. Is that right? No, those are the Pilgrim's boats. See, I'm getting confused. So let me go back to my slideshow here. So I think that's a good example. It turns out that y'all know both the sort of basic facts about Christopher Columbus, like he discovered America, which is a very strange thing to say about a continent where a lot of people already were, like maybe they had discovered it. And also we know that the Vikings got here first a long time ago. So I think that's just an interesting example of when we talk about American history, who even discovered America, not this guy, who named it America Vespucci, that was a whole different thing, not this guy, who owns it, again, again, the things that we teach children, very confusing. So part of the problem here is textbooks. So I imagine it's safe to assume that you already hate textbooks and textbook companies, based in large part on their resale value, which has become kind of a joke. Again, I have another meme about, you come in, especially for science textbooks, and you pay $200, and then when you try to sell them back at the end of the semester, it turns out you can get like $14. And part of this is very much a scheme on behalf of the textbooks because, clearly the more textbooks you can sell, the better. And so they keep updating the knowledge sort of incrementally so that technically your textbook is out of date. I recommend buying stock in textbook companies as a way to fight the power. But one of the things that I wanted to tell you about was the way that the textbooks can kind of control what we learn. And the textbook industry is real sketch. It's mostly controlled by just 5 companies. And again, these names should look really familiar to you. 80% of it is owned by these guys. Pearson, McGraw-Hill, Cengage, all of that should sound relatively familiar. Like if you look at your textbooks, especially your science textbooks, that's probably what you'll see. And The issue is why this might be a problem. And this comes down, again, to historical perspectives. These 5 companies are choosing what we teach our children. And sometimes they're choosing that based on values that are not necessarily shared by everybody, if you know what I'm saying. So let's pause and go to our second video. So, screen sharing is stopped as the shared window is closed. I don't even know what that means, Zoom. Okay. So what I'd like for you to do is go to the second video that's under Moodle, and it says Texas textbook changes. So let's all go watch that video, and we'll come right back. Okay, you guys done? It's important to see that guy at the end who wants us to repent. He's my favorite. So you'll never guess how the Texas school board voted. I'm just kidding, yes you will. So I think that's a great example. And one thing that I want you to be aware of is that McGraw-Hill is based in Texas. And I think that also Pearson might be based in Texas. So the decisions that the Texas school board makes can have very large impacts. So this has a lot to do with the power that the textbook company has and what they choose to put into the world. So let's go back to this. These are some pictures that I wanted you to see. Very recently, there was an uprising about one of the Texas textbooks again, and it's this picture at the top left here. And as you can see, it says, the Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. So it's kind of innocuous. It's small, it's one word, but at the same time, workers. like, get the fuck out, like those are slaves. So it's I think a really crucial thing. If we reframe history as, no, these people were workers and they got paid. And also, look, you can see it says that they were brought here, or no, I'm sorry, that the trade brought them here, but it doesn't necessarily mention that it brought them against their will. And that's very important for American history. On the bottom, this is another one of the protests that they had about science, not superstition, and standing up for science. But I wanted to be clear that this issue is not new. Over here on the right, we have just a gorgeous picture, I love this picture, of a woman in the 60s protesting exactly the same thing. So the argument is that she doesn't need those dirty books, here we're talking about textbooks for children, because she has the Bible. So this idea about what we should teach children and from which books is not new, but the idea that only a few companies are controlling the textbooks is new. And that's one of the things that I want you to be able to keep in mind. So look at your textbooks with a critical eye. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is who's teaching history. And the history teachers that you're going to have in middle school and in high school as well, generally speaking, not history people. They were not history majors. They are not scholars of history. Most of the time, the people that teach in public schools are truly, truly the average of the average. And so what that means is that the most average students in college go on to teaching programs, and the most average students out of the teaching programs go on to work in schools, and the most average teachers who work in the schools stay there. So very often, the people who are scholars end up not teaching. The people who are scholars and are good at it end up giving up because teaching is extremely difficult and in a lot of ways not rewarding at all. Being especially a public school teacher is just a terrible job. And on the one hand, I want to recommend it because we need teachers so much. But on the other hand, I could never recommend that for you. It's the worst job in America. So the teachers themselves, number one, have no idea what's going on. They're teaching from the textbooks. They have no idea. And again, number two, they're exhausted and they're underpaid and it's a terrible job. So what you learned in history was very heavily impacted by the teacher as well. What we have here are two more memes, but I wanted to show you this one on the left because I think it's funny because it's very clearly intended for boomers. There's a lot of comics that are like for boomers, by boomers. And in this one, they're talking about how the children are terrible at learning because they don't recognize George Washington. And one of them thinks he's gay, which I don't understand why that one is problematic or why that's even in there, but I think that's like boomer humor. And this idea that these young children, these people who are questioning this painting and don't recognize it are one day going to cancel out your vote. And on the one hand, it's like, yes, they are. That's how voting works. You'll die. But on the other hand, I just think it's a really interesting sort of scare tactic, this idea that the children are all coming for us. And on the right, of course, this idea that teaching is the worst job because your salary is low and everything is your fault. So are the textbooks bad? Yes. Are the teachers bad? Yes. But maybe we shouldn't blame the teachers as hard as we blame the textbooks. So one of the questions that we have when we talk about historical perspectives and we talk about historical events that are kind of uncomfortable, people sincerely ask this. This question I actually lifted directly from another video when people were arguing about the way that we talked about the Civil War in textbooks. And he argued that we shouldn't dwell on the past if it's uncomfortable. Sure. And it's a really interesting thought because often in American society, we don't like to talk about things that are uncomfortable. That's not what we are taught as part of our socialization. It's divisive, as I'm sure a lot of you have noticed. In the past few years, your Thanksgivings might have gotten a little worse. The simple recognition of historical facts can be very triggering, especially for people who might have been impacted by that or whose families were directly impacted by that. So some people think that we shouldn't teach the hard parts of history. They think that we shouldn't teach the parts that are uncomfortable and that we shouldn't teach the parts that are divisive because it makes us sad. Which, again, I think there's a place for escapism. I follow a lot of Instagram accounts that are just baby animals, but at the same time, I think that there's a really important place for teaching facts, especially historical facts to our children. And one of the phrases, like the idioms again that we hear, is this concept that if we don't, tell each other about history, we're doomed to repeat it. And evidence would indicate that even if we do know about history, we just repeat it anyway for funsies, but at least we know a little bit better now. Like we know the warning signs of things that are going to go terribly wrong. We know, historically what people tend to fight about and how that tends to work. So I would argue that even though this can be deeply uncomfortable and sometimes really unpleasant, we still do have to teach it. So, well, again, I'm very interested in hearing what you think about this. Again, do we need to teach genocide to children? Maybe not. There's an age at which things become appropriate, but like, facts. So, one aspect, of not teaching difficult things is what we call changing the narrative. And changing the narrative is when essentially you're looking at a situation and you kind of pivot. And this has, again, become a very common political tactic in the last few years, but really in the last few decades. So sometimes we sort of change our version of historical events. And this is something that you're going to see in the book about the Confederacy. Very often we sort of frame historical events in a different way so that we can remember them differently. But one thing that I really want you to keep in mind is sometimes we change our narrative about an event that is happening right now. So for instance, I want you to keep in mind what you are seeing on the news about, for instance, protests in Atlanta, which is deeply personal because they're like next to us. And I want you to keep in mind this idea that you can have a narrative about something that's happening right now, and you can sort of shift that narrative. And what I really want you to keep in mind, the most important question in all of history is, okay, but who benefits? So if you change the narrative and you say, oh, the Civil War was about states' rights, well, who benefits from that argument? And if you say, okay, well, the looters are bad, then who benefits from that argument? It's a really crucial thing for us to keep in mind. So as one example,
I have a comment.
Where are you?
Price.
Okay.
Do you think that the people that don't go to jail benefit? Those that aren't getting involved?
Yes. I would argue, yeah. Not getting involved can be very beneficial.
All right.
But I'm interested to hear what y'all say on Thursday again. So at some point in probably high school, did you have to read 1984? Probably.
George Orwell.
One of our classics, yeah. So in 1984, they have an entire department that is responsible for changing the history books every time that they want to change their social narrative. And the most famous sort of line from that part of the book is, we've always been at war with East Asia. So in that book, it was, an allegory, but they had a literal department that was responsible for changing the history books to match what was happening that day. So we do this sometimes in America. Sometimes we're at war with Russia, and sometimes Russia's our best friend. Sometimes, we're at war with France, and sometimes France is our best friend. Over the course of history, we kind of change our minds. So this is, again, one of the things I want you to keep in mind in regard to benefiting from changing the narrative. And the other thing is this idea that you might benefit from revisionist history. So this is kind of the same thing, except you're talking about things that happened a long time ago. So revisionist history is when you sort of rewrite what happened with just little changes. So one example, this is Plymouth Rock. So what can you guys tell me about Plymouth Rock? What do you remember?
This is where one set of pilgrims landed in America.
Right, remember, so they had, I think, again, there are 3 boats that came to America, and they landed on this rock. Again, one of the crucial stories that we tell children, especially when we're getting ready for Thanksgiving. This is a rock that you can go visit near Providence, Rhode Island. This rock has nothing to do with anything. This is not Plymouth Rock. This is just a rock. They just realized that people wanted to visit Plymouth Rock, and Plymouth Rock was probably a cove, not a literal rock. But when they realized that tourism was available, tourist dollars were available to be earned, they took a rock, a pretty big rock, and they put it inside a fenced area, and you can pay money to go look at it. Plymouth Rock. So there's a lot of things in American history that are kind of that way. If we just sort of shift our narrative a little bit, we can make it sound better, and we can charge you to take selfies there. So,
Is the rock at least from the cove?
my understanding is that it is from nearby, yes. So did pilgrims walk on it? Maybe. I would like to think that. I don't know. I haven't ever seen the rock in person. I wish we could go on field trips. We could go visit. The other thing that I wanted to be kind of clear about is very often when we talk about changing history and we talk about changing narratives, people become concerned that this might just be like a giant evil plot. And it's not nearly that organized. Like there's not like a cabal of white people like making the changes that I know of. They've never invited me if there is. But we do change history to suit ourselves, and very often it is changed by the people who are in power. But as far as we can tell, they don't like have meetings. We just sort of do this piece by piece.
Can it be unhealthy to our mental health if we think it's a conspiracy?
For sure, because then you start to doubt everything. The problem with conspiracy theories is that, you know, you start with a nice fun one, like the earth is flat, but almost invariably people who believe in conspiracy theories believe in other conspiracy theories, and then it gets dangerous, like you stop believing that vaccines work or something like that. So conspiracy theories can be quite dangerous.
Okay.
But I do enjoy documentaries about flat earthers. Okay, so this is sort of our last thought of the day. This idea that if we are aware that there are historical perspectives, and if we are aware that they might have been changed by people who want us to believe something different than what actually happened, what can we do to be better about it? Because that's always the question, right? Like you know, Maya Angelou says, like, if you know better, do better. So that's kind of one of the goals of this class. Like, how do we do better? So for one, read and examine multiple versions. And this is true historically, for sure, but this is also something I'd like to advise you to do in regard to the news. It's really interesting, I think, to check out the news from other places in the world, or to watch, you know, like a progressive, like, hardline progressive anarchist news source and like a hardline conservative news source. Like, it's kind of interesting to compare and contrast the two. So be sure to look at multiple sources if you have that option available to you, and the internet makes that really easy. We also have to be mindful of listening to the voices of the losers. So if history is written by the winners, what did the losers say? Sometimes those documents are literally destroyed, but if we can, I think it's really important for us to not just examine multiple versions, but examine the versions of the people who were sort of the least empowered. Also, we have to think critically about our own beliefs. Kind of one of the things that we'll talk about is this idea of confirmation bias, which is where, like, if you see a headline and you agree with the headline, you're like, yeah, like that must be true, because it's very comfortable for us to believe things that appear to us to be true, and for us to believe things that fit into our narrative. So you have to be a little bit careful. This happens to me every once in a while. I'll see a piece of news and I'm like, yeah, but then I look into it and it was not true. So this is a hard thing to do, because it's so much easier just to believe what you believe and not question it, but that's irresponsible, and also it's scientifically inaccurate. Which brings us to my last point. We do need to practice healthy skepticism, and that's true of every news source. Again, in large part because the news is mostly opinion now, so it can be hard to get like news. But that's something that we've got to practice, especially as we are going through historical events. That's going to give us a really unique perspective on previous historical events. Which brings me to our final slide. Oops, I clicked on the wrong. About a middle school history teacher in 2050. Then in the 20s, there was a presidential impeachment, a threat of US-Iranian war, global pandemic, and a massive economic recession in the first 3 months. And what I really love about this meme is that it was made in March, and it's gotten worse since then. So one day, when students go back and try to learn about the year 2020 in history school, it's gonna get weird. It's gonna get real weird. But you'll be able to help them, because you were there. So that's the end of lecture today. That's a whole lot of information. Now that I'm looking at your faces again, does anybody have any pressing questions? Or even not pressing questions?
What is dangerous about viewing what's going on in the world as a conspiracy?
It makes you doubt all the facts. So, like, some of the facts have to be true, right? Like something has to be true. So, but if you come into it with a conspiracy mindset, it can really shape your view of truth in a way that can turn out unhealthy.
Well, I think that Derek Chauvin was involved as an anarchist, and that he wanted to cause something catastrophic.
Which may be true. Not all the conspiracy theories are untrue.
Now, does the definition of conspiracy mean that you think it's the government, like political leaders' fault or the low
Did-
people?
Did you believe that they're covering it up? Typically, a conspiracy means that you believe that the government or someone in power is covering the truth.
So looking at Trump going to the church with a Bible, doing a photo op in front of a bunch of Secret Service agents, clearing Lafayette Square, what message is he trying to send?
See, I think that's a great example of, we know now that it's not a conspiracy that he did that because we have so many facts. You know what I mean? So like, it sounds like a conspiracy. Did Trump tear gas peaceful protesters literally in front of a church? It sounds like a conspiracy, but one of the things that we know now is that in fact it isn't. So that's, I think, a pretty good example of looking at the facts as critically as possible from multiple sources.
And then being able to see grace throughout all the wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, to be sure, some conspiracy theories have to be true. Like, that's some of them. It's just that it can get dangerous because then you start to doubt everything.
Okay.
And also, conspiracy theorists tend to be very unhappy people. It's a hard way to live. And when we measure it, they tend to have higher rates of depression and anxiety and alcoholism. And it tends to get kind of dark. So what we are going to do tomorrow is we are going to meet up for our separate individual chats. You should know which group you're in. And I'm really looking forward to this because I think that this is one of these topics that we're really going to benefit from being able to talk to each other. So I am going to go ahead and end this Zoom. I will upload it and I will see you all tomorrow. Stay safe.
You too,
Thank
ma'am.
you.